All right. So as people filter in, I want to be the first to welcome you to our webinar today. It's entitled Mapping and Analytics for the BEAD Initial Proposal. It's crunch time. So first order of business, I want to just quickly introduce Sanborn. This is part of an ongoing series of webinars that we produce, and the recordings are available on the mapping channel on YouTube. So you can head over there. And we will be distributing it. The Sanborn Map Company has an unbroken record of producing high quality and very detailed maps that dates back to 1866. And as many of you know, Sanborn acquired Applied Geographics last year, 2022, and created a company that is a geospatial powerhouse that brings together in one place all the things you could look for in geospatial data solutions, strategic consulting, analytics software, and a variety of services. What you may not know is that our commitment to broadband dates back to the National Broadband Mapping Program of the 2010s. And even less well known is the fact that Sanborn and AppGeo worked together during that program, building broadband maps and map portals for several states from 2010 to 2014. And in the current funding cycle, we're proud to be supporting and working closely with several states, Oklahoma, Massachusetts, Michigan, and Rhode Island, to name a few. And we're also working closely with Connected Nation and several other states. So without further ado, I want to introduce you to our speakers today, presenters. Justin Pizzari is the senior broadband strategist with us. He worked for 5 years at the NTIA, and he brings a wealth of detailed program knowledge to the Sanborn team, as you'll see. David Breeding leads a team of data scientists at Sanborn, and that team has completed thousands of challenges and is working with several state broadband offices on their data strategy. And last but not least, Bill Johnson has a distinguished career of 30 years in state GIS. He was the first GIO for the state of New York. And before joining AppGeo a few years ago, he helped build the geospatial program at USAC, where he was engaged with mapping broadband data at a national level. So very quickly, our agenda today, we have a three-part, three-act play. We're going to talk about where we are in the broadband program. We see it as having 4 stages. We're going to talk about the game plan for success in the current stage. And then we're going to wrap up with some discussion of comprehensive data strategy and how that provides a foundation for everything else. And so to start us off, and without further ado, I turn it over to you, Bill.
Well, thank you, Tom, and good afternoon, everybody. Great to have such a nice group of people joining us today. We've got a slide deck here that's going to be distributed afterwards, hopefully to reduce the note-taking demands. But we're not going to be reading off these slides. The slides are kind of background. What this really is going to be is a conversation among our team. And hopefully that'll give you some insights about things that maybe you haven't thought through all the way yet. Maybe they're going to be coming up for you. And so we want this to feel like you're pulling up a chair around a table with our team and just hearing us bat ideas around. That's the vibe. Please add your questions to the Q&A. We're going to reserve about 15 minutes at the far end of this to address your questions. So go ahead and add them there as we go through this. I just want to say, before we get into it, our newest team member is Justin. He's only been with us for 3 months, but it already feels like we've been working together for years. He's really an exceptional add to our team here, and it's just great to have him on board. And I think you're going to see we've already got great chemistry with him as part of our team here. All right, so let's get right into it here. Now, we're describing this as 4 stages of the broadband program. That's actually our lingo, not NTIA's, but it seems to make a lot of sense to us. The part that began this program was really understand the scope of the problem. Where exactly are all these and underserved locations in your state? So very mapping centric. And then this new process that was, unveiled to us last fall to be able to challenge the fabric, and that's the layer that has all the broadband serviceable locations. And then we got our first taste of the new national broadband map from FCC in November last year. It's incredible. It's only about 9 months ago that we got the first national view of broadband availability at the broadband serviceable location level. That's entirely new. So that gave us a really good footprint to work with going forward. So that's our stage one. Where we are now is in developing the plans for how we're going to spend this BEAD money. And we're going to be spending most of our discussion today talking about what's in that stage two, because it's really important, because it lays out exactly how we're going to do the rest of the program. Stage three, which will start next year with the state challenge process to confirm the eligibility of all the locations you want to fund. And then it's the construction of the broadband networks, and the grantee, sub-grantee process and the tracking of that. And then finally, as that winds down, we'll be in the final stage of this program looking at the outcomes. What did we actually get for our money with this investment? So we're going to be, again, I just wanted to lay that out very briefly here. We're in the stage two planning, and that's what today's conversation is going to be about. Now, Justin's a significant football fan, and we're in kind of the pregame season here. And I know Justin's been thinking about football as an analogy for what's coming up here in stage two. So Justin, why don't you go ahead and kind of unpack that a little bit for us?
Sure, thanks, Bill. So really what we wanted to do was start out the discussion, kind of framing the conversation and sort of using the football analogy. I'll roll through a couple of these, but we really want to frame it. And then we're going to get into sort of the meat of the conversation and really talk about and dig into some of these issues that are right in front of us. So as we sort of have in front of us here, the goal is really to reach all the unserved and underserved BSLs with 120 broadband service. And as we know, as a lot of us have started looking at the cost quest data, that may be challenging. So we're keeping that as our goal. And as we think about this analogy, we move on to what's the playing field? And really this is, where are these locations of unserved and underserved? What's the existing broadband infrastructure as far as we know, from outside data, third-party data, data that the state has? Any of those sources going to help us better understand really what we have to work with in our playing field. What are the geographic conditions? I'm out here in Colorado. A lot of issues with mountains. Each state sort of has their own geographic conditions that they're dealing with, and then state-specific considerations. So really, what is the temperature in the state? Who are the stakeholders that are engaged? Really, what is the focus of state leaders, and what do they want to get out of this BEAD program? So really, all of those really formulate the playing field and really sort of set the stage for what we're going to do. If we move on, we all were really excited when the state allocations came out from NTIA. They kind of represent the salaries and really what we can do, right? So we have a set allocation. Now we have to figure out how can we reach all these and underserved BSLs, and with what technologies. So that really sort of sets our ceiling on what the spending would be there. A lot of flexibility in there. We'll get to talking a little bit about cost modeling and sub-grantee process. So there's a lot you can do, but you do have that set number. As we move on to the rules, as we're probably overly familiar with the BEAD NOFO, and we sort of understand, NTIA has come out with different guidance documents that have sort of guided us along through the initial proposal, volume 1 and 2, and the BEAD challenge process, all of which we'll talk about here today. And then one thing to point out there is the rules is the flexibility the states have to add in modifications that they need or they want to put into the BEAD process. And then as we move on to what are the plays, this is where we really work with our states on developing the approaches that make sense for them. And so how are they going to get broadband infrastructure to the most unserved and underserved locations? And a lot of that we're going to get we're going to go through now in developing the challenge process, and that flows all the way through the subgrantee selection process. For our conversation today, we obviously know the BEAD life cycle is much longer than that, but those are the things that are kind of right in front of us and that we're planning. And so if I kind of step into, what is this playbook that the states have, and where are these flexibilities and the documents they need to create? First is the challenge process, as we've talked with states a lot, and how they're putting that together within their volume 1 of their initial proposal. What does the high cost threshold modeling look like? And as the cost quest data came out this month, there's a lot of analytics going into how you're doing the high cost modeling and modeling really the costs across the state. The subgrantee selection process. So really, how are we going to set it up so that we're covering all these BSLs that we want to cover underneath the BEAD program? A lot of options there, and a lot of flexibility. Also a lot for states to think through, and the timelines for this, if we keep our eye on December 27th, is a way off, but really we should be thinking about all these items now in parallel. We'll talk about the BSL bundling approaches. This kind of goes with the subgrantee selection process, and one of the tools that we've developed to sort of help with really all of these different challenges that we have within the initial playbook.
All
So,
right.
go ahead, Bill.
Can I interrupt you just to
Sure.
pause for a second here? So before we get too much into these granular details here, I know you were recently at an event out in Denver, the Mountain Connect conference here, and heard from and met quite a few of the state broadband leaders. Like what were you hearing? What's the mood about the states as they deal with all this requirements right now?
So very concerned about the timelines. Very concerned that they're getting everything done in a timely manner to meet what NTIA has set up as sort of the framework.
Mhm.
A lot of concern about the challenge process, how they're going to run that, and really within this state, we call it the state challenge process. I think it's a good opportunity, Bill, to point out. We had the FCC fabric and availability challenge process, which is still ongoing, and states can still participate on that, and we encourage that. Now we're moving into the state BEAD challenge process, where the state is creating that, and along with that goes building a portal, and along with that goes figuring out what modifications you might want to make from the NTIA model guidance. So there was a lot of talk at the conference about that issue. I think right on the heels of that is really this, there was the anticipation at that point in time, because the cost quest data hadn't come out, of what is the cost quest data going to look like, what is it going to tell us, because that feeds directly into how we think about the subgrantee selection process, which may be sort of the one area that states are really concerned about, because that gets to the essence of what's going to be the success of this program, who's going to be implementing it, what ISPs. And so there's a lot of concern there about setting this up properly, and really understanding the different elements about how to run that process.
Okay, can I pause you again?
Sure.
I don't want to skip too fast over the BDC and fabric challenges. I know there were some states that were able to scramble and get quite a few challenges filed, and there were some states that frankly missed the window. Hadn't really the offices were still staffing up, and just weren't able to meet those super aggressive timelines. And I want to bring David into the conversation here, because what we're seeing is every time there's a new release of the data, you can get some ugly surprises. And I know, David, you've got a particular example that you can talk about at some length, really.
Yeah, no, thanks, Bill. It was very interesting. We came into the process kind of expecting this kind of every 6 month release, and kind of waiting on these new versions to come out, and a lot of compare and contrast. How is it changing? But what we're coming to learn as we watch how the FCC is kind of rolling out these changes, it's happening faster and more iterative than we were expecting. So it became critical to kind of keep really close attention to how it's changing. And right before the allocation, working with a state, a new version dropped, and we saw a whole new ISP show up to the tune of hundreds of thousands of locations, and that really just put us on a back foot a little bit, because it's like the worst time for that to happen for the
Yeah.
state.
So this was state of Michigan, correct?
Correct. Yes.
Yeah.
In Michigan, they were, and there was some kind of news and writing about that situation. But I think, and we'll talk more about data strategy, but really having the data in order and available to kind of watch this happen and respond efficiently is going to be critical. It was critical at that moment, which Michigan was actually able to work quickly with the FCC to actually kind of create a condition which enabled an appropriate representation of what the ISPs were communicating at that point in time. But it just kind of really established in my mind the criticality of having this organized, because it's going to keep changing, and you're going to have new findings. And even after, that those findings are established, you need to kind of continue to check yourself as things are changing. So again, it's been a really exciting at times process, but it's going to be critical for everyone's success to kind of keep an eye on how this is developing.
Yeah. So yeah, you're reminding me that what I was describing as stage one with the BDC and fabric challenges, that line actually shouldn't stop at the start of stage two, right? It continues. In fact, it doesn't even end at the end of the BEAD program. The Broadband Data Act that set that process in motion has no end date on it. So these are continuous processes. All right.
And
So,
Bill, I would say also that it's not too late if a state hasn't really participated in that, or participated very lightly. Like you said, it's ongoing, and that's something that we always talk about, and sort of the intersection with the BEAD state challenge process. So it becomes a bit involved, but you can kind of do some of the things, the availability part, in the state process, but for fabric, you really still need to go through the FCC process. So if there aren't those BSLs, that's important.
Right, because those locations have to be represented on the FCC map for eligibility.
That's correct.
So if you have critical locations that are missing, the burden is really on you at the state level to submit those as fabric challenges to get them into the map so that you can spend BEAD money to reach them. So that's really important. Now, Justin, I know you've written a couple of blogs about the nuances around these decisions that go into which version of the map to use, which version of FCC's map to use in the state challenge process, and also the timing of the state challenge process. And we've got, you'll notice the 2 bullet points on the slide that's displaying there right now are actually hyperlinks. So when you get this deck after the webinar, when we send it out, you'll be able to go. If you haven't read these 2 blogs, they're quite good and quite detailed about those nuances. But it all gets back to the point David was making about making sure that you're mounting these challenges. So the earlier challenges, the BDC and fabric challenges, have a significant part of your decision around your state challenge process. It's a little confusing. The term challenge process is used in 2 different ways here. The state challenge process is really kind of a different critter than the BDC and fabric challenges, but they are intertwined and in ways that are not necessarily obvious. So any comments you want to make about that?
Sure, Bill. I was kind of thinking about this, early this morning, and I said, well, what do these 2 blogs kind of boil down to? And what they boil down to is really strategic planning, and they really both are about timing, and but specifically for the version of the map. And so, you want to be cognizant of this data that comes out and is updated by the FCC, updates their map, and does that give the state an advantage or not an advantage? And so, you can look through the language of the NTIA, and they do strongly encourage you to use the latest map when you initiate your challenge process, but it's strongly encouraged. And so really you want to use the version that best represents what you understand as a state is happening in various areas. And so that's really important, the timing there. And then initiating the challenge process. I think what we've been talking about is making sure that you really lay that out in your initial proposal in a very thoughtful way, so that you get the results that you're looking for. And so you're building the portal to get that input so that you can potentially flip those BSLs on the map. So again, you're really reaching all the locations and reflecting the on the ground reality. So I mean, we touched on that in a bit more detail, and I think we'll move on, but that's the essence of what we're talking about, and it all boils down to the timing and the strategy behind it.
Yeah, and in particular, what you're nibbling at without really taking a big bite out of is the like how successful a state is being with the BDC and fabric challenges. Coming up with the compelling evidence to get those locations added, or to flip what an ISP might be overstating for what they offer for service at that location. If you can come up with the right evidence to get those corrected, so that your universe of BSLs that you want to spend BEAD money on is legitimately eligible as a
Mhm.
result of the state challenge process. So that's
Yep.
what it's all about, right?
Yep, that's right.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm gonna jump in real fast, but the versions, right? Just to kind of bookend this, we got the allocations based on V2, and we've noticed at least 5 different changes to that V2 BDC kind of that data. So it's kind of changing that number of under and unserved, and so really being prepared to compare and contrast what comes out for the V3 BDC, which is still actively being collected by the FCC. And then, there's not many conditions where we think it makes sense to wait to V4. But again, it's kind of it comes down to doing your work, doing your due diligence, and kind of comparing and contrasting what's going on here, and really thinking about where you understand the need for broadband is, and which data set is aligning with that vision, which you can then take forth into the BEAD state challenge process to kind of create your rules, and which enables you to kind of address that need. But it is, as we've said, established by this underlying data.
Okay. And I think we want to help people understand one point that it took me a while to fully digest, is that at the conclusion of your state challenge process, you have your universe of eligible locations. But you can, to the extent that additional eligible locations appear in downstream versions of the FCC map, those are eligible as well. And that took a little bit of poking and digging to figure that out. So that's important, and that speaks to the need to continue to file fabric and BDC challenges with every new release of these data sets. It's really in your interest to do that, because they have to end up in the FCC map to be eligible. And so it's kind of a living universe of eligible locations. So great. Justin, anything else to add before we move on?
No, I think we're ready to move on.
Okay, great. So I think the next thing we wanted to talk about was this challenge navigator. And why don't you go ahead and give us a little bit of a thumbnail about what the purpose of this is and how it operates.
Yeah, so the challenge navigator is what we really want to start with is sort of the foundational element is the mapping portal, is a mapping portal that we built for states or that states already have, and which reflects sort of what happens throughout the BEAD life cycle. And so what we've done is we layered on top the challenge navigator, which will allow the states to manage the challenge process. So the initial challenges, the rebuttals, and eventually like what the adjudication says. And that'll be reflected in that mapping portal. So really this layer is that point in time when you're running the challenge process. Within that challenge navigator, we can see, the BSLs, and really this is really that for that opportunity for the ISPs, the nonprofits and local governments to get involved in that process. We've also built in on the next slide a speed test. So for those that are participating in the challenge process, they can take the speed test right within the portal, and that data will be collected. And so a lot more nuance to this, but we wanted to touch on it that this tool is what we're using with many of the states we're working with to help them create that portal and then run the challenge process when they're ready. Which a lot of states, if we're talking a timeline, are really using sort of the fall to do this planning and strategy, and then the implementation would be in the beginning of 2024 is sort of the general consensus. Obviously, there's some states that are very much ahead, but that's sort of generally where the sweet spot is that we see.
Yeah.
Go ahead,
Let me
Phil.
ask you a little bit about the speed test component, because I know NTA put a lot of boundaries around what's going to be allowable for the speed test. Can you speak to that at all?
Yeah, I think one of the elements that we build into this is taking the speed test from from a household and on three separate occasions, 3 separate dates. So we built in functionality here that'll allow us to follow up with whoever submitted that first speed test to kind of remind them that, hey, this is that you need to take another speed test and eventually get to those 3 in order to make that a valid challenge for that BSL. So we think that's important because that becomes a bit tricky to remember to do that 3 times, 3 different
Yeah.
times. So we're really we're glad we built that functionality in there. That's sort of the one area that I would focus in on because it becomes an area that people have a lot of questions about.
Okay.
And just sorry to hop in there, but like that functionality, that feature kind of ultimately aggregates these challenges and then is kind of packaged up for collaboration and validation at a local level, where they can then kind of, states can kind of collaborate with many of the partners that are going to be, needing to kind of take a look and kind of get some buy-in on the appropriate representation of service. So just kind of, that connection between groups, I think, is important as someone was interested in the relevance of some of this to local government. So I wanted to kind of call that out for a moment.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you.
And really build that outreach component, right? To make folks aware that this is ongoing and to increase the level of participation, I think is very critical to getting to these areas that could really benefit from having multiple speed tests be submitted through the navigator.
Right. So the challenges from the eligible entities, which just to refresh here, those are not-for-profits, ISPs, and local units of local government, correct?
Yes.
So an individual taking a speed test, that gets rolled up kind of as part of what's submitted through a local government. Is that how that alignment with that category works?
That's right. That's right.
Okay. Yeah. All right, great. So the challengers, how a challenge, if I'm an eligible entity and I want to challenge, how am I using this tool?
So we kind of showed on the previous slide, but what you put in here, just gives you the ability to say, whether you're an individual or an ISP, nonprofit, whatever category it is, you can put in the type of speed test or the type of challenge you're doing. So one being a speed test. There's the whole chart of the different categories. Then you can put in your information, put in really what it is you're doing, and then you can upload additional evidence. So it allows you to sort of do the full walkthrough of what's provided in the guidance, and really allows you to put that challenge. And then when it comes in, then it's we require you to put in all that information so that things don't get partially filled out, so that they can be valid challenges. And then we automate some of this to look at what has been submitted, but there's always that human element of looking at this and seeing what makes sense, what meets the criteria. So there's that balance between the two.
Okay. And at the end of this, we have after the adjudication is completed by the state broadband office, these locations are then re-reflected on the portal. Is that right?
That's right. They're reflected in the portal, and then they're also submitted to NTIA as part of the requirements, and then NTIA would eventually reviews what those results are, and then you have that record that you keep as to what were the results of the challenge process.
Okay, great. All right, I think we can move on here. Yeah, so the next thing, I mean, this planning stage, the state challenge process, and the description of how that's going to work is what's people are submitting as volume 1 of the initial proposal. I know a few states have already submitted their volume 1, but most states, I think, are working on that. Many, I think, are hoping to get it submitted early for early review by NTIA. But there's 2 other critical pieces here that we want to talk about. One is this, which is the high cost threshold modeling. So let's unpack this a little bit, Justin.
Okay. So as the cost quest data came out recently, what we've been doing sort of on a high level is running those models and taking a look at what are the costs across the state, what are the net present values of of serving these BSLs, and really, what does the landscape look like? We've
So
been
can I
go ahead.
let's bring in David
Sure.
here, because I know David has started to look at some of the analytics you can run against that cost quest data. David, maybe you want to just describe that a little bit. Like what would a state do with that cost
Yeah.
quest data set?
Yeah, one of the things we've been looking at like immediately is, right, you can start at looking at a state level and say, are we going to have enough money or not? Right. That's what this underlying data says for as a greenfield price, which quickly greenfield assumes that there's no real asset for them to kind of tie in and build out to, kind of the most expensive kind of assumed condition for build out. And let's just go, and all of this information's at every BSL. And so first you want to kind of filter down to just those un and underserved locations, remove all of the funded points, which those un and underserved locations, which might be funded, and then roll it up. And so we've done that, and that's kind of the first starting point. But I think the next level is to really think about how are you going to kind of looking at a state level is one, but can you break it into other units of geography, which are maybe, a little more representative or can kind of expose some more of these trends? Like we were thinking about, counties or municipalities or potentially prosperity regions in Michigan specifically are ways to kind of look at that same kind of data, but kind of group it. And you see different trends kind of popping out where, is it telling you, is it confirming what you understand to be the truth? Like this is some of our most rural areas and it's going to be the most expensive. Or in some cases, is it kind of presenting you with information which you didn't understand or you wouldn't actually have expected? And that's kind of where we're getting into. So it's where it's not making sense, where, for example, you have two BSLs very close to each other, but they have very divergent kind of information about them. We start asking ourselves, well, this is a really challenging model to develop. If you just kind of step back, like how are you going to model at every location, what it costs, all of the dimensions here? But how can we use the data that we have, or a state has, to understand it more deeply? Like, for example, using infrastructure data. That is a really valuable thing to kind of go, okay, well, yes, our nearest fiber asset or our nearest kind of tower is very far away from here, and this makes sense. So really just trying to bring in, I think, and where we are today is kind of bringing in this other data, looking at the distance, looking at the terrain, thinking about, the land use types. Are you going to need could the cost be a function of kind of having to go through a national park or some kind of sensitive area which might have more costs associated with it? It really is this process of building data to help you really kind of come to not trust but validate, trust but validate kind of what's going on here with
Yeah.
your understanding of the universe. So that's really where we are today. And just kind of another really important piece is in this data is what's the NPV kind of information, which
Yeah,
is
it's just gonna be,
describing. Go ahead.
yeah, that's, yeah, I don't want to just skip over and assume everybody knows what NPV is, right? You were going to tell them what that is?
Yes, sorry about that. So the NPV kind of it's a formula that kind of goes to seek to define the profitability of a project.
Yeah, it's
Net present value.
Yeah.
And so there's two dimensions in that. One is the time period, which you're kind of trying to quantify this value, this project, right? There's an initial investment, and then there's a series of years in which that infrastructure will be leveraged by a number of customers, right? And so there's that. It's 20 years actually in the data, the cost quest data. So they're kind of projecting the value over a 20-year period. And then there's a discount rate, which is something that it's not exactly clear exactly the discount rate that was used in the model, or kind of, and whether that discount rate reflects what type of business or organization that might be investing in kind of doing this build out. So there's a little bit of unknown in there, but I think what's most interesting about that dimension today is looking where it's profitable and where it's not, especially as it relates to high cost kind of thresholding, right? Where you see an NPV that's positive, that is a normal indication of business that we want to be doing business here. Where it is negative, they're probably, a business isn't going to immediately jump in and kind of invest. And so where that break is in your data is a really good, and where we're looking is like, well, how do the prices in these areas where it's already a negative NPV, where do they fall? Let's do some kind of percentile breakdowns. Let's go figure out, and do some testing on, well, in these areas at these thresholds, what would the cost be if we had different levels of support by the state? How much would we expect in kind of relative investment by the businesses? And just sort of play out those dimensions both at a state level, but also in specific geographies. Because I think there's a real opportunity to kind of maybe think about the high cost thresholds spatially. You might have different ones in different areas to encourage activity where it might be more challenging to get it to happen. So use the data you have to help that helps you understand your environment, but also use the cost quest data as a kind of really good starting point to try to come up with some of these dimensions, like the high cost threshold.
Great. Now I know we've had, like in Michigan, they had a round of grant applications for the ARPA money.
Mhm.
And so there is fresh data that shows what some of the ISPs are willing to build out to locations. So we have, fresh estimates of cost to each location. So how would you take advantage of data like that?
So yeah, we definitely took a look at that in advance of the cost model coming out and try to do a regression model just to kind of maybe predict as the that dependent variable what would the investment be, right? I think it was interesting. We're still kind of comparing it in Michigan to kind of see if there's agreement with our model against what CostQuest is predicting. But one of the important dimensions is really the fact that you in the ARPA process or the Robin process in Michigan it was allowing various ISPs and investors interested in building to select their own BSL. So there was a selection bias from a business perspective in only selecting what they were interested in. So again, when you start to over compare against a place where maybe there's negative NPV and it's really expensive to operate, we're starting to see disagreement in our model. So again, it's another layer of information, and I think people should consider, any early signals. If you do have a lot of RDOF kind of being deployed in your state, as another potential metric, another existing piece of data for you to kind of use to evaluate those areas where you're not, the existing model is giving you mixed signals on what the price may be.
Yeah. All right. So the takeaway I'm getting out of this is not a once and done. It's keep bringing in, looking at additional data and factors and iterating, and it's going to get you closer and closer to an understanding of where you want to set that high cost threshold.
I definitely would recommend, looking at other sources, but there is the fact that you could endlessly kind of dig into this. So I think you're going to need to make some tough decisions around. We can control the risk of under or overestimating in certain areas we have lack of information, but we're going to have to operate with less than perfect information in this process. But using the data to the best possible extent, within reason is really where we're trying to land, and that's the Goldilocks zone, which I hope we land there. I think we're on a way to finding that spot.
Yeah. Justin, before we move on, did you have other points you wanted to make about the cost modeling?
I think this is a really good segue to get into the subgrantee selection, because David really talked about sort of, the NPV and the state data. So I think we should move on to that and dig in there a little bit.
Great. So why don't you go ahead, Justin?
So yeah, sure. So moving on to the subgrantee selection process, as you sort of think about the timeline and how these things are done, all that work that goes into that cost modeling is really going to help you set up and understand how to design your subgrantee selection process. Just hitting on the basics here, the eligible entities, ISPs, co-ops, those types of entities, and really, looking at what does the state really want to do. Stretch those BEAD dollars as far as they can with fiber. Do a combination of fiber and fixed wireless when it makes sense based on the high cost modeling. It really is a state specific approach on what is your strategy for, we use the term future proofing, or, at least or the other sort of the other option or other options in, sort of setting it up so you're improving the service across all the BSLs of unserved and underserved. And really feeding into that, the area that I want to talk about a bit is sort of how do you think about the subgrantee selection process as far as bundling locations? So David kind of touched on in the Michigan case when they ran their state program, letting the ISPs bid and bundle on locations, and so that kind of in and of itself has some implications. If we look at this slide, sort of how we lined it up here on the options bill. And these are by no means all the options, but sort of kind of laying out the spectrum of not bundling location BSLs at all, and really letting the ISPs kind of choose and group those locations and submitting them into the state. And then sort of on the other end of the spectrum, using the data analytics that David was talking about to bundle locations and make them attractive for the ISPs and co-ops and other entities. Looking at where the really high cost and extremely high cost areas versus the areas that are lower cost, easier to reach, and putting them together to make them an attractive group or subgroup, as some may describe it.
I just want to interject a little bit here. So I think what we want to understand is that if you go with the first option and don't do any bundling, allow the sub-grant applicants to kind of self-select the location they want, they're going to do what good business people should always do and pick the ones that are most likely to have a return on investment quickly, and probably not select the difficult, hard to reach ones that have a very low return or a long timeline before you start to see a return. So the risk there is, while it's easy to do a strategy like that, you risk fragmenting the landscape and leaving out some of those difficult to reach locations, right? So,
Yes.
So that's why you would want to pre-bundle. The idea with pre-bundling is to create combinations that include these difficult to reach sites, bundled in with some ones that are more attractive to an applicant, so that they on the whole look at all the locations and say, I can still be profitable. This will still work for me, and yet it'll reach the goal of including those hard to reach locations. Did I capture that right?
You did, and I'll add a little bit of sort of in the weeds, but the variations in between.
Yeah.
So really, what we're thinking through is, states running multiple rounds of this, and how do you set those rounds up, and how much time do you have? Do you the sort of what we've been seeing is 2 rounds is fairly doable, very doable. Multiple rounds might be doable, but then you're really looking at maybe timeline issues to do more than 2, but certainly doable if you line it up. But within that, really thinking about, do you put out these pre-bundles and then get some feedback from the ISPs, almost like a sub-grantee selection process, to get some information and intelligence from the ISPs on really what makes sense to them, and then move on from there in a second round? Or do you just go straight forward, pre-bundle them, put them out, what makes sense through the data analytics, and then run that process, and sort of see how that pans out? So I mean, we could spend a couple hours going through the scenarios of what could happen here, but I think this is probably, in my mind, one of the most critical parts of what's right ahead of us. It's really going to determine a big part of the success of your BEAD program. And so, I mean, the big takeaway here is really dig into this, and don't take this lightly. This is going to be a big determining factor once you get into your monitoring and implementation of what's actually going to happen in your states and how you're going to service those unserved and underserved BSLs. So critically important in what we're thinking.
Yeah.
Just one. Sorry, go ahead, Bill.
Oh, just going to. All right, I'm going to take it, David. So I guess what you're reminding us all, Justin, is how important the geospatial data is, and the map analytics to this whole process. It's like every step of the way in BEAD, you really have to be on your game with mapping and geoanalytics here, because that's how you're going to intelligently go through this bundling set of scenarios to figure out what's the right approach for you.
Yeah, and as you go through maybe multiple rounds, rerunning, as David mentioned before, rerunning the data analytics, rerunning the bundles, maybe putting in a factor that you are finding is very important, that's going to then group these in a way that does make them even more attractive for the ISPs, right? Making that business case for them to do that investment. So, yeah.
David, Did you
Yeah,
want to?
the comment I was going to make is anything that you can design in your process to give you more data about the market conditions and interest will enable you to further kind of refine your efforts. So this hybrid or these multiple iterations is just more information like ARPA and those data points. If you can kind of design a process that enables you to kind of, understand where people are, because there's there's a whole dimension of people interested in doing this work, and you want to have understanding about where they fall and how they qualify or quantify places of interest, and use that information to create bundles or create artifacts that allow both of those kind of interested groups to operate, and ultimately trying to achieve this like the distribution of service everywhere. I think it's really, we don't have I always want more data, so that's my bias, and that's what my recommendation would be, is to create a condition where you have more information to support your decisions.
Yeah, I'm looking at the clock, guys. We're going to have to step on the gas a little bit here, because I want to make sure we have time for some questions at the end. Some questions are already coming in. So, Justin, why don't you talk a little bit about the portal here?
The portal really is the foundational piece. It's where you internally and externally and internally are going to reflect what's going on through the BEAD life cycle. And so as we talked about, we layered the challenge navigator on top, but this is really where the transparency comes to light for folks seeing how the BEAD process is unfolding.
Yeah. Okay, great. And I think that's a nice segue to the last thing we want to talk about briefly, if we can advance to the next slide here, which is this data strategy. We keep talking about data strategy, but what we're understanding is that all of this mapping, and there's different levels of it at different stages of the program, should all coexist and be part of a broader, comprehensive strategy that goes through the whole life cycle of BEAD. So the same data that you use to map your understanding of it becomes this additive pieces that come to the mix to help you with the planning and your state challenge process. And then you use that same data to track your progress through the sub-grant awards and how those awardees are building out. And then you use the same data to look at what you got at the end of the day with your outcomes. So that whole through line of mapping with the data strategy. So let me just break this down for you very quickly. Let's go to the next slide here. So we're thinking of it as building blocks. So each of these building blocks has data behind it, which are on the next slide. Don't run to it yet. But when we're thinking about the different components of the BEAD program, they're all combinations of what you see in these building blocks. The stuff at the bottom is, the fabric data and the FCC data on broadband availability, and then what you're doing to understand middle mile and community anchor institutions and so on. And then this over on the right here at the bottom is your understanding of the demographics and the covered populations that need attention through digital equity, for example. And then we get into the middle tier where it's a lot more analytical, and we're really trying to understand what are the barriers to full broadband adoption, which is where we want to get. And as the program is unfolding, that green building block is, how are we conveying to the public what's going on with this big investment? How do we make sure that the transparency is there so people have confidence that we're spending the money well? And at the end of the day, what did we get? We're going to want to measure. What are these things? We probably care less about how many miles of fiber we built, and a lot more about how many kids can actually now do their homework online instead of having to go to the Taco Bell parking lot and those sorts of things. So that's what this building block strategy is about. It's all the way through. And let's go to the next slide here. I'm not going to read this off for you, but you'll get the deck later, and you can see examples of all of the geospatial data that aligns to each of these building blocks and how those come together. David, I think you made a point to me the other day about one of the things that you would do when you're thinking about a data strategy, and it's the difference between treating each set of requirements as a unique universe, as opposed to thinking about requirements and how does it fit into the broader strategy. You want to give that example?
Yeah, definitely. this process has moved very quickly. And I think one of the things we learned early on is starting to see this interconnected nature and this strategy. And it really was manifested in this one example, in Michigan, where we're working to kind of collect, basically collect proposals for build out, and this realization that we need to kind of plan ahead to make sure that our grant systems and the database kind of entities we're using to track that relate back, and we can connect to our actual, those locations which are going to define BEAD. And this, you run the risk of, focusing on these in isolated kind of projects, to have them all be disconnected and really miss out on the outcome reporting that everyone really is most interested in. So, have a plan, store your data well, think about where these key relationships are, and you're going to be in a great position to communicate effectively about what you're doing, and really put that on display, and show that you're really kind of putting these funds to good use to the end goals of this program. So, that I think that was the thing that I wanted to kind of, I think that you were mentioning, Bill, that example.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I think, Justin, have we covered all the particular items that you wanted to before we go to Q&A?
I think so. My final comment is, we're focusing in on BEAD here, but really we're with this data strategy, talking about all your broadband work and other programs that are ongoing that we certainly don't have time to talk about today. But there'll be other programs. And so setting up this strategy to be able to handle when those programs pop up, that's what we're talking about here. Is it obviously is for BEAD, but there's going to be more. This work is not going to end at the end of BEAD. You have that phrase, Bill, that you say this is sort of the beginning of the real focus and investment on broadband infrastructure in the US.
Yep. All right. Well, thank you. We've got a bunch of questions popping up in the Q&A, and it's not too late for you to add yours. So if you're hearing things and you want to know more about any of this, just go ahead and get that in there. So we'll spend the last part of this going through these. I see this one from James Mitchell here. If I know the location of every building address, actual, not geocoded, and the service addresses from all ISPs, what am I missing? I don't need to know who the ISP is. James, I'm not sure I know what question you're asking here. Justin or David, do you see what we?
Well, when you need to know the ISP, like especially around the speed test, is who's doing the test, and that's how we can relate a test to a location. I'm just kind of swinging here, but that.
Yeah, and I guess
I'll just jump in, Bill. Just one example that pops is is there multiple ISPs at that BSL or a single ISP? That tells us a lot. That really has a determining factor on whether that challenge is valid or not. If there's multiple ISPs, you need to be able to test both of them. Most people can't because they don't have two services, right? So there's in the weeds stuff there.
Yeah. And actually, okay, I think I can speak to this a little bit now that I see where we're going with this. The data sets that the FCC releases, which is the BDC data, each record describes a level of service at a location, and that location is connected via an ID back to the fabric. So when you do a join between the BDC data set and the fabric data set, you get a one-to-many. If there's more than one provider offering service at that BSL, you get the multiple records attached to that BSL, and those are at a true latitude, longitude location, not a geocoded location. So, James, I hope you know that's the way you work with that set of data from the FCC. Is you join all of your BDC records by location ID back to the fabric, and that allows you to then map it and display it and analyze it.
Yeah, and James followed up just quickly in the chat at the very end. Yeah, it is, to get to the and underserved is a function of the ISPs operating at every one of those locations. So you just need to evaluate the sum total of service there. And they are constantly in flux. We do see the data changing often. So the profile at that ISP is changing every time, an ISP comes in or an ISP is removed or they change their service. So it really is a moving target at times, but you're going to have to put a stake in the ground on a version in your state challenge process for what it is, and then operate from there. So again, it gets back to that versioning kind of idea, understanding what these versions are saying and what the implications are where. It's been a challenge to really kind of nail it down at times.
Okay, great. Let's move on to the next question. So this is from Chris Cantrell. This discussion appears to be targeted to the states. Is this also relevant for local governments? And Chris, I think the answer there is yes. And the reason, the very specific reason, is local governments are one of the 3 categories of eligible entities that can submit challenges through this state challenge process. And so if you're in a unit of local government, you have a very important role to play as the state runs this state challenge process, because that state challenge process is the set of procedures that are going to result in the final set of eligible locations to spend your BEAD money on, right? So Justin, anything to add to that?
Yeah, no, they're a critical element. So, you know, we certainly local government involvement is going to be required for a robust challenge process.
Yeah. Okay, let's move it on. I see we had 2 questions from Wilma Robertson. And Wilma, great to have you join us. Wilma is the Geographic Information Officer for the state of Idaho. I heard a rumor that although the official V3 is not until later, it's also updated, I think, locations rather than availability more frequently, but not announced as an official release. Is this true? And then she asks with a clarifying question, even though V4 is not coming out for a while, V3 is being updated regularly, true or false? David, I'm going to turn to you for this one.
You know, what you see right now when you go to the broadband map and you go to the download section is you're seeing updated versions of the BDC, which are currently related to V2, right? You know, you'll notice the first drop down there defines the date. And so the 12/31/22 is the V2 version. We have received V3, but right now they're in the collection and association of BDC, you know, of that ISP information, that service information with the V3 locations. You know, because V3 shares loc IDs, you could join the V2 service with V3, but really, you know, the appropriate data set to start joining with V3 is when it's when that first release of version 3 BDC comes out, which we're hoping for in November, if the timelines hold true to how they've historically dropped. So hopefully that's, you know, but yes, I think, you know, it is being updated frequently. You know, these kind of set releases and dates, it's changing behind the scenes. You know, there are details about the changes. There's change logs, which are getting better version to version that you can find in the FCC publishes. It takes a little bit of digging and kind of evaluation to kind of understand what's going on. But yeah, you know, and do you have a V4 question? Yeah, V4 isn't coming out for a while at this point. So, you know, but I think just watching it and being prepared to have the infrastructure to kind of watch the change and understand it, given what Bill said, there is an opportunity to kind of continue to enrich this underlying set if more locations are showing up in later versions of the fabric. But yeah, you just got to keep your eye on that as you progress through the process.
Yeah, and I'm going to pipe in with one other point, Wilma and others. There is a predictable schedule for the releases of the fabric. A new version of the fabric is dropped just before each BDC reporting cycle begins. And those BDC reporting cycles are from March 31st to June 30th, and from December 31st, from September, boy, I'm getting confused here. Justin, help me out here. December 31st to March 30th, right?
30th, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you can expect to see a new version of the fabric released just before each of those windows opens again, because they want the ISPs who have to file the BDC data with the FCC to be able to align their data sets to a more current fabric. And when an ISP submits their data, they have 2 options. They can draw polygons and say, all of the BSLs in this polygon have this type of service, or they can submit individual records that are tied to a BSL ID. So that's the other way they can describe their locations. And if they're doing it that way, they have to have a current version of the fabric to do it. Okay, so let's move on here. We have another question here from anonymous attendee. Just for verification, Sanborn is a vendor for creating a challenge process portal for states. That is absolutely true. And by the way, that's not a plant. We didn't plant that question, but yes, we would be happy to talk to you if you're interested in more about that. All right. And I think that's the last question here is the clarification from James Mitchell, which we've already talked about. So I think that wraps it up. Unless anyone's got an additional question, go ahead and quick drop it in there. But if not, we want to thank everybody for joining us this afternoon. We will certainly circle back to all of you with a link to the recording. Once we've cleaned up the recording and have it ready to post, we will send you that link, and you will also have access to the slide deck. And in that deck, again, as a reminder, are the links to the two blogs that Justin wrote recently about timing and map versions to be considering for your state challenge process. Any final words of wisdom, Justin?
Yeah, Bill, before we break, there was a question that was submitted about sort of, oh, I don't know where the question went. Really, the essence of the question we could touch on really quick is when we set up the mapping portals, how much can it interact with the state, and if we transfer over that software so the state can have it. I'm kind of paraphrasing because I thought the question was here.
Yeah,
It's not.
I found it here. It says, what type
Okay.
of software would a state need to have a challenge portal like the Oklahoma example? Is it AGOL, ARC Enterprise, or ? And do you host the challenge portal, or is it set up on the state's system? So that was the question.
David, could
Yeah.
you take that one?
Yeah, I can answer that. So, currently we have developed the Oklahoma portal that we've developed is a custom developed solution. We're using, without going too far into the details, a Postgres backend. I think it's an open layers kind of map control, but long story short, we're kind of rendering all of that content. It could be it's currently hosted in the cloud, in the Google Cloud specifically, but it could be hosted in any number of clouds if that was the preference. It's not currently leveraging any ArcGIS kind of software, but I believe we could set it up on the state system once there was a conversation about the tech stack that the state might have, because obviously, depending on the state, there might be concerns about having this information in a particular type of hosting environment. So, be a conversation we'd be interested in taking further.
Okay, thank you, David. And I see another question here. As a follow-up, if you host, does the state own the data?
All the data in the portal is coming. Yeah, it's the state data. So we've been kind of publishing the assets, at least in Oklahoma's case specifically, or any of the portals actually where they're developing. It's really the state's data to own. The derivative artifacts we're developing in the analytics, assuming we were under contract, would be yours to own. Some of our methods, we could kind of get into the details there, but yeah, the outputs, the derivatives would be, the state's.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And I'm seeing another question from James Mitchell here. I'm going to turn to Justin for this one. If speed is not an issue, if a location has ever been served by any ISP, is that site still eligible for BEAD funding? I think I know the answer, but I'm going to let you answer it.
Looking at that, Bill, what we're looking at is the most recent version, usually of the FCC map, and what the ISPs have reported in there. And so, as that changes and evolves with the different versions, what happened in the past is updated continually. I think that's the gist of the question.
And but to his question, like, it could still be eligible if it was served. And then, because we found in certain challenges, an ISP said they were there, said it was served. We challenged it. That's no longer served because of that challenge. And now that BSL that was uneligible is back and eligible. So I think it will continue to oscillate depending on the data that's ultimately used. And again, getting back, it's constantly changing. It's a little bit of a moving target, because ISPs are expanding their service. There's more funded kind of implementations of broadband kind of service coming online. And so, there is this moment to lock things down, and that's coming, which comes back to really understanding what the data is saying today and making sure it aligns with your understanding. I think I'm repeating myself a little bit, but it's definitely a challenge to watch this at a very granular level and watch those changes. But we've set up some infrastructure to enable that type of close review.
Yeah, and really the short answer to your question there, James, is it doesn't matter what the past status of that location was in terms of served or underserved or unserved. It's what's in the most recent version of the BDC data. And again, as David reminded, subject to any successful challenges about that. So, what happened in the past is in the past. Eligibility is based on current conditions.
But it's really interesting. They deployed another version of the fabric midstream. So there's 3.2, right? So there's just a lot of, I think there's a lot of things changing. And if you blink, it's going to be different. So you really, that's been my job, is trying to keep an eye on all of these changes and having the systems to kind of sift out what significant changes on there. Is there a new ISP coming onto the playing field, right? That we have to compete against, or understand are they really where they say they are? And that's that's a really big challenge, given how fast things are changing. But I know we're over time, and appreciate everyone's time and attention today. Yeah.
No, I think that's a good point. And from what I can see in the chat, we've covered all of the questions, which is great. So want to thank everyone. If you have any questions, we're using Justin as our primary point of contact, and we'd be happy to engage with you and learn more about your situation.
I just want to jump in and say that Justin's email is at appgeo.com, appgeo.com. The sanborn.com alias should be working, but in case it isn't, use appgeo.com.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.